Scott, what would make this an especially useful conversation for you today?
Yeah, I believe that I'll be retaking the LSAT for the second time in 2 weeks. So then I'm kind of stressed out at the moment. And at the same time, I feel like I've done much of the prep already. So I'm looking forward to any of your last minute expert tips.
Yeah, sure. So
thank you.
How many full-length exams have you done up to this point?
I've taken 15, I believe.
Fantastic. All right. So you've taken more than the minimum I would suggest. So don't feel the need to do too much additional at this point.
Okay.
It's really about pulling it all together.
Gotcha.
Maybe a timed exam or two per week over the next 2 weeks, along with detailed review. But that alone would be sufficient in my opinion.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Sure. Are you studying full-time right now or working? Yeah, you're full-time. Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the risk that you run, honestly, is the risk of burnout, doing too much.
Perhaps.
How many hours per day are you studying?
I tried to aim for what you recommended in a previous video. So I aim around 5-6 at most of intense studying with breaks in between.
Perfect. All right, so that's good. So just don't do too much. Less is more. Take some days off. Never do exams on consecutive days. And review all my advice on test day prep. I have an entire playlist devoted just to test day prep advice, what to bring, what not to bring, how to simulate test day conditions, what to do the morning of. So that contains all my general recommendations on what to do. And I think that given that you're studying full time, like I said, I think that the biggest risk you run is just trying to do too much.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. The question that I had for you first was, sometimes I'm missing too many lead questions of the logical reasoning sections. So say from questions 18 to 25, 26, I tend to get easily 4 to 6 wrong. Mm-hmm. And before that, from 1 to 15, I get at most 2 or 3 wrong.
That makes perfect sense given the order of difficulty. And those later questions in this section, you're going to get them wrong more likely just because they're more difficult. Mm-hmm. So I'd say flag a couple of those to come back to at the very end, because the ones at the very end, like 25, 26, might actually be a little bit easier than those in the late teens and early 20s. So get used to quickly identifying which types you are most likely to have trouble with, so you can flag those and skip them, come back to them later.
Excellent.
Those might be parallel reasoning, principal application, questions with abstract language. Just know them when you see them and don't get bogged down with them, because everything, of course, is worth the same.
Understood. Sure. Okay. And before that, say that there's many quantifiers such as most, not all, some, and so on. So in what context would those words be helpful, and what context would those words be clearly red flags of the wrong answer?
Sure. So it's important to know what those words mean, of course. Mm-hmm. And I have articles and videos on this. Assuming that you know what they mean, I think that they're useful because, think, for example, parallel reasoning. Mm-hmm. You want things that are of equivalent meaning. So the word some and the word most don't mean exactly the same thing. There's room for overlap, of course, but I would pay special attention to those words because they do mean a lot. They can limit or expand the scope of what they're talking about. Those are quantifier words, in a way, actually qualify or limit the range of what they're talking about.
Okay.
So I would definitely pay special attention to them.
Gotcha.
Another way in which they can come up is related to how strong they are. So for more question types that want more moderate language, like inference questions or necessary assumption questions, you'd want to gravitate towards words on the lower end of that spectrum. Rather that it's harder to prove most or all than it is to prove some or many, because some and many are vague and could potentially be just a few.
Fair enough.
They are it's easier to prove moderate quantifier words than more extreme quantifier words. But for a strengthening question or a sufficient assumption question, it could be all. It could be most. That's totally fine, because they're opening the door to new information. Doesn't matter how strong it is, as long as it gets the job done.
Gotcha. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
As a follow-up of this, I think that I have a question for you on general inference questions for RC and LR. So sometimes I find those questions a little bit too vague or like hard to infer something specific. Do you have any general tips as to how to better approach those kind of questions in both RC and RLR?
Well, in our reading comprehension specifically, process of elimination is your friend. The correct answers are very often worded in unappealing ways, ways that you would not necessarily pre-phrase yourself. So I would look to knock out the ones that you know for certain to be wrong. Then whatever remains, even if you don't love it, by elimination must be your answer. And as part of your review process, as an exercise, go back always and find the exact line references supporting the correct answer, so that you can see how they twisted what was in the passage and rephrased it in, again, an unappealing way. So it's a process of exposure to get better at that. Then for logical reasoning inference questions, like I said, gravitate towards the more moderate language because it's more provable based upon the stimulus than more extreme language would be. And so, of course, quantifiers are one thing, but the degree of certainty in the conclusion as well could be an indicator. So always, never, sometimes, most of the time. That degree of certainty, in a way, is also a it's a number, it's a quantity, because it's the quantity percentage of how likely something is to be the case. So look for that as well. Again, more moderate is more likely. But the correct answer for an inference question could be a variety of things. It could be a combination of two different parts of the stimulus, or it could just be a paraphrase of one particular sentence, and the rest of the stimulus was in a way just filler to make the other choices seem more appealing.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you for that.
Sure.
As a follow-up of this, sometimes I feel like for the first section, for the very first questions, I might be not as focused yet. Do you have any general recommendations as to how to be better, like awoken, I believe, right from the bat and get going straight up instead of building up some momentum per se?
Yeah. So this comes back to test day prep, doing warm-up questions before you walk in.
Okay.
So bring some printouts or photocopies of questions you've done before and feel comfortable with. Not too much, just a single game or a single passage or a handful of logical reasoning questions, things you've seen before and are totally comfortable with, so that the first questions you're doing when you walk in are not actual scored LSAT questions. You have to toss them before you enter the test center, but you can do them in the lobby or the rating room or a coffee shop around the corner or in your car, whatever your circumstances are. Just do them right before you enter at the last possible minute, because there may still be some time while they're setting everything up before you actually start.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
So just in case, I also do think to test in January as well, because I'll be taking it in November and January then. Do you recommend me applying in December anyways, and then wait for my score in January as well?
That's a very tricky situation, because then law schools will evaluate you presumably based upon your November score when they haven't even seen your January score yet. So the question is, do you want them to evaluate you with both scores or only one? If you want both scores, wait until after January. If you only want November, and I'm not sure why you would if you're planning on January anyway, then you do what you will. But the thing is that ultimately applying later with the January score is okay. January is not too late, and getting even a single point more on January makes the wait worth it.
Gotcha.
So I would suggest, if I were you, I would wait. I would get everything pulled together, but I wouldn't hit submit until the January score is released, because you don't want law schools to evaluate you with only your November score. Because if they evaluate you and reject you, then essentially you're waiting a whole nother cycle.
Fair enough. And in terms of retakes, they're not badly seen or like bad perceived or anything, right?
They're not bad as long as you don't have too many. And I would say if you have 5 or 6 takes, that's probably too many, and that warrants an addendum of some kind. But if you have 3 takes, I don't think an addendum is warranted. 4 is kind of on the fence. You may want to write an addendum based on your circumstance, but ultimately the question is, were you taking all 4 in consecutive months, in which case they might question your judgment, or are they spaced out over a longer period of time? So let's say if you took September and October and November and January, which actually isn't allowed anymore under the new retake limits, but theoretically, if you took them back to back like that, they would say, this person just keeps taking it over and over. They don't know what they're doing. But if you took 2 per year over the course of 2 years and they were all spaced out, they'd say this person is busy with work. They studied a bit more. But as long as you're studying and prepping for a decent chunk of time in between multiple retakes, that won't necessarily raise any questions of judgment. How many takes do you have?
1.
Then you have nothing to worry about.
Gotcha. I think that I also had a question for the role of statement questions. So I find those questions sometimes weirdly worded and really complicated to approach. And I always tend to focus on the conclusion first, but even then, sometimes the answer choices are slightly confusing. Do you have any general approaches on this?
Sure. Yeah, so the answer choices for role of statement questions will often use abstract language. And so as an exercise, what you could do, especially as you move forward for your retake in January, is just do several questions involving abstract language only. Those could be role of statement, they could be flaw. Those types of questions often involve the abstract wording that you don't typically see in everyday life. And so look up all the words and phrases that you don't understand, that you're not familiar with, so that if you do come across them again, you'll know what they are. But basically, I think it comes down to evidence, conclusion, sub-conclusions, and then counter premises. Most things fall within one of those categories. And so if you recognize that not all arguments are just evidence, conclusion, there could be other stuff in there too, and you recognize that they could have multiple layers, then you'll be better able to relate the correct choice to what you see in the stimulus.
Gotcha.
And also, as an exercise, you could see for the wrong answer choices, how might they be tempting, and how do they relate to other parts of the stimulus, the ones that were not the statement in question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
Last question, I believe. In terms of the RC passages, sometimes I find the science-based passages much more challenging. And even though I tend to try to focus on why this part is connected, this part, I find it difficult to judge a part compared to different ones, because if you don't quite understand what's going on, it's harder to see the function of the whole passage, I believe. So do you have any tips on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that science passages in general can be a lot harder, especially for pre-law students. I'd focus not so much on the details as just the author's opinion. Focus on that alone as your jumping off point. Okay. And obviously it can be tough to see the different pieces of different roles that different statements play. Again, this comes back to role of statement, like in logical reasoning. What is the function? Why did they say this? What purpose are they trying to achieve? And so if there is some initial statement that the author is then arguing against, you might want to see, are different pieces of evidence serving to attack the prior viewpoint that the author disagrees with, for example. But I would try to caricature or exaggerate the different viewpoints in the passage to make them easier to understand. Again, not getting too bogged down in the details. Like you could have old versus new, or incomplete versus more complete, or good versus bad, whatever it is.
Gotcha. I think those were the questions that I pretty much had for you. Do you have any last minute or general tips for all 3 sections or for prep day whatsoever?
One last idea that comes to mind is that since you are going for both November and January, is make sure that you save a handful of recent exams for January. So I'll often say, do the even numbered ones now in the 80s, for example, and save the odd numbered exams in the 80s for the January retake. Don't burn through everything new now, because then you won't have much to use for January that's recent. And in January, to me, if you're planning on both, then November seems to be more of a dry run where you could do decently. But if you're already planning on January anyway, that's the real end date in my mind.
Okay.
So that comes down to the point where why even take November? You could consider, if you're not close to where you want to be, withdrawing for November and shooting for January instead, just to avoid having an unnecessary take on your record.
Okay.
But let's talk. We can take a few minutes to talk about this if you like. I mean,
Sure,
what's the reason to go for November if you also have January in mind?
Because even recently, I was debating between that and what a friend of mine told me was he was in the same boat and he chose to take both because in his mind stated he was aiming for 165. He'd rather have two chances of getting there instead of only maximizing your stress on January.
That seems reasonable to me, honestly, because if you could potentially achieve a score that you'd be happy with in November, then why not? There's not much downside to retaking since law schools don't average multiple scores. They only take the highest. This is only if you think you have a decent shot at getting it in November, but you may. Let's say if you're, what's your practice test average right now?
162.
Good. And you're shooting for 165 plus?
Ideally, yeah.
Okay. So that's reasonable. I mean, that's a reasonable goal to shoot for, especially for January. But even for November, there's a margin of error, a score band of 3.5 points on each end. So you could potentially get 165, even if your average is a 162. You might. And if not, no big deal because you're retaking January anyway. So that seems like you're going about it for the right reasons. And I think you're set up for success here. And just do everything you can for January, make the most of the holiday period, the winter break, to take some more exams and focus more on your review, of course.
So you believe that 3-point increase would be mostly down to my process of reviewing and my critical thinking based on the skills that you just talked about?
Yeah, based on the level of detail in the questions that you're asking me and the fact that you're already in the 160s, that suggests to me that you already have a good foundation in the basics of this exam. And as you said, you're getting tough logical reasoning questions wrong just because they're hard. It's not about the question type anymore. So to me, it's everything you get wrong and everything you have difficulty with, reviewing that all in excruciating detail.
Gotcha.
So you can figure out the patterns in the mistakes that you're making so that you can avoid making them again. Absolutely. Awesome, Sky. Well, it was great connecting with you today.
Likewise.
What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call?
I believe that the fact that you're saying that taking some more time to prep for the January 1 and not rushing to applying first, that was a big source of comfort to me because I wasn't really sure if I should be applying first and then tell the schools to wait for my score in January. But you're simply telling me to hold on to this. Don't be too stressed out about that. And 1 point can make a huge difference. So might as well take more time to prep and then hopefully get a better outcome.
Fantastic, Sky. Well, please keep in touch and let me know if you need anything at all as you move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.